The list appeared on the giant crystal screen above the trial grounds, and the entire crowd of nobles turned to look at my name, Novice. That single word hung there in glowing letters, while 1,000 alien eyes studied me, like I was a joke that had wandered onto a stage meant for legends. I stood at the edge of the registration platform, wearing a simple gray field jacket, while beside me stood contestants covered in polished bio-armor that shimmered like liquid metal under the twin suns of the verdant Combine homeworld. I am Ethan Hale, and I had traveled 40 light-years to stand in a place where my species was not considered dangerous enough to rank properly. A tall woman stepped forward from the noble section, her presence pulling every eye in the arena toward her, the way gravity pulls a stone. Her armor was carved with symbols of old hunts, her hair braided with small silver hunting charms, and her eyes carried the calm confidence of someone who had never once been told no. This was Princess Chevelith, heir to the Combine throne, and one of the most celebrated hunters in the history of her people. She walked toward me slowly, her boots clicking against the stone floor, and the crowd went quiet in that particular way crowds go quiet when they expect something entertaining to happen to someone else. "So this is the human they sent us," she said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "I was told you're kind-built machines that fly between stars. I did not expect them to send us a farmer." Laughter rippled through the noble section. I said nothing. I had learned a long time ago that silence unsettles people more than any clever answer ever could. She circled me once, studying my jacket, my boots, the simple pack on my back with no blinking lights or humming energy cells. No armor, no neural weapon, not even a tracking blade. She shook her head slowly. "Earth must be a soft little world." "It used to be," I said quietly. Something in my tone made her pause for half a second, but she recovered quickly, turning back to her circle of noble friends with a smirk. "Careful," she said to them, loud enough for me to hear. "The novice has a temper." More laughter. I let it wash over me the way rain washes over stone. The truth was, humanity had not sent me here because I was a diplomat, or a scientist, or a soldier chosen for show. I had been sent because the Concord Council needed someone who understood how to survive in places that wanted you dead, and the people who picked me knew exactly what I had done before the stars ever opened up to us. But none of that mattered here. Here I was Novice, because Earth had no official hunter caste, no ranking system the Combine recognized, and no one on the Registration Council had bothered to ask what I had actually done with my life before I put on this jacket. The hunt trials were not just a sport to these people. They were sacred, a ritual stretching back thousands of years, where young nobles proved their worth against creatures pulled from the deadliest biomes across a dozen worlds. Contestants were tracked, timed, and broadcast to the entire Combine, and the beasts they faced were never simple animals. They were apex predators, refined by evolution into perfect killing machines, and every year at least a few contestants did not walk out of the trial biomes the same way they walked in. Princess Chevelith had faced 3 of these creatures in her life, and subdued every single one without a mark on her skin. She was, by every measure her people used, close to perfect, and she looked at me like I was something that had wandered into her world by mistake. "Tell me, human," she said, turning back toward me one last time before the ceremony continued. "Why did your people even bother sending you? Was there no one else brave enough to embarrass themselves?" I met her eyes for the first time since she had approached me. There was nothing hostile in my expression, only a quiet steadiness that seemed to bother her more than any anger could have. "I volunteered," I said simply. That answer seemed to annoy her more than anything else I could have said. She studied my face for a long moment, searching for the fear she expected to find there, and finding none. Finally she turned away with a small shake of her head, muttering something in her own language to the noble beside her, something that made them both laugh again. The ceremony continued. Names were called, beasts were assigned, contestants stepped forward one by one to receive their trial biome, each greeted with cheers from the crowd, each carrying weapons built specifically for the creature they would face. When my name was called, there was no cheer. There was only quiet, curious mockery, the kind reserved for something people expected to fail in an entertaining way. A handler stepped forward, holding a small data tablet, and read out my assignment without ceremony. "Crin Hollow Fang," he said, and a murmur moved through the crowd like a wave. I did not know yet what that name meant, but I could see it in the faces around me. Several nobles exchanged glances. One of the older hunters near the front actually stopped laughing. Princess Cheveleth's smirk faltered for just a moment, before she caught herself and covered it with another cool smile. "Interesting," she said, mostly to herself. "They gave the novice the beast that has ended 3 noble hunters in the last 10 years. She said it like she expected me to turn pale, to beg the registration council for a different assignment, to prove once and for all that I did not belong here. Instead, I simply nodded and asked the handler a question that seemed to catch him off guard. "What is the terrain like in the Hollow Fang's trial biome?" The handler blinked at me, clearly not expecting a real question from someone he had already filed away as a lost cause. "Dense stone canyons," he said slowly. "Low light, caves that run for miles underground." "And its hunting pattern? Does it hunt alone, or does it call others?" A few of the nearby nobles turned to listen now, their laughter fading into something closer to confusion. This was not the kind of question a frightened novice asked. This was the kind of question someone asked when they were already building a plan in their mind. The handler, unsure how to respond to genuine curiosity from someone he had assumed would simply panic, answered honestly. "It hunts alone, usually. It relies on heat sensing more than sight. Its territory is marked by scent trails along the canyon walls." I nodded slowly, filing every piece of information away with the same care I had once used tracking wolves through frozen mountain passes, or following the trail of animals that had grown too dangerous for the land they lived on. This was not so different, I told myself. Different world, different creature, same discipline. Princess Cheveleth watched this entire exchange with a strange expression on her face, something between confusion and irritation. "You ask questions like a scholar," she said, "but you carry no weapon like a hunter. Do you plan to talk the beast into surrendering?" A few nobles laughed at that, and I let them. I had learned long ago that the people who laugh loudest before a hunt are rarely the ones who understand what a real hunt requires. "I plan to understand it," I said. "That's usually enough." She rolled her eyes, clearly done wasting her attention on someone she considered beneath serious consideration. "Understanding will not save you from a Hollow Fang's territory instincts, human. Confidence built on ignorance is just another word for foolishness." I did not argue with her. There was no point arguing with someone who had already decided the ending of a story before it had even begun. As the ceremony wrapped up and contestants were led toward their designated preparation chambers, I felt the weight of dozens of curious eyes still following me, some amused, some mildly concerned, none of them expecting anything remarkable. I did not blame them. They had no reason to know what I had survived long before I ever stepped onto a ship bound for their world. They saw a man with no armor and no fear, and their minds filled in the gap with foolishness, because foolishness was easier to believe than the alternative. As I walked toward the preparation chamber, one of the older hunters, a grizzled man with scars across one side of his face, stepped briefly into my path. He studied me for a long moment, the way a woodsman studies weather clouds before deciding whether to bring in the herd. "You did not flinch when they said the beast's name," he said quietly, not unkindly. "Should I have?" I asked. He considered that for a moment, then shook his head slowly, stepping aside to let me pass. "No," he said. "I do not think you should have." It was such a small moment, easy to miss in the noise of the crowd, but it stayed with me as I walked toward the chamber that would prepare me for the trial ahead. Not everyone here was laughing. Not everyone had already decided who I was. Behind me, I could still hear Princess Cheveleth's voice carrying across the platform as she spoke with her circle of noble friends, her tone light and amused, clearly already certain of how this story would end. "Give it 3 hours," she said. "The novice will call for extraction before he even finds the beast's trail. I did not turn around. I simply kept walking toward the chamber doors, carrying with me a quiet certainty that had nothing to do with confidence for its own sake, and everything to do with knowing exactly what I had done before, and exactly what I was capable of doing again. The doors closed behind me, sealing away the noise of the crowd, the laughter, the mockery, all of it fading into a distant hum as the chamber's systems began preparing me for the biome ahead. Somewhere beyond those walls, a creature that had already ended 3 noble hunters was waiting in the dark, unaware that the thing it was about to face was not measured by the tag placed above its name. I closed my eyes, took a slow breath, and let the last of the crowd's laughter fade from my mind. They could call me whatever word they wanted. The hollow fang would learn who I actually was soon enough. The preparation chamber was quiet, except for the low hum of the biome generators warming up behind the far wall, and I used that silence to check every piece of equipment laid out on the metal table in front of me. A young technician named Oliver stood nearby, watching me with obvious curiosity. He was younger than most of the staff I had seen so far, and unlike the others, there was no mockery in his expression, only genuine interest. "You are really going in with no armor?" he asked, glancing at the empty rack where the other contestants' gear usually sat. "Armor slows me down," I said, checking the small pack of tools I had brought from home. A short blade, a coil of thin rope, a device that read heat signatures through solid rock, something the Combine engineers had allowed after I explained it, was standard equipment for tracking wildlife on Earth. Nothing flashy, nothing built to intimidate. Oliver studied the heat reader with interest. "This is old technology," he said. "We have far more advanced sensors." "Old technology still works," I said, "if you know how to use it properly." He considered that for a moment, then nodded slowly, as if filing the thought away for later. "The princess says you will not last an hour." "The princess says a lot of things," I replied, and Oliver actually laughed, quickly covering his mouth, as if surprised at himself for finding humor in something that was supposed to be serious. "Why did you not correct them?" he asked after a moment. "When they called you Novice, you could have told them the truth." I paused, considering the question carefully before answering. "Because words only matter to people who need them to feel safe," I said. "The Hollow Fang will not care what rank is written above my name. It will only care whether I understand it better than it understands me." Oliver seemed to turn that thought over in his mind, and something in his expression shifted, a flicker of respect that had not been there a moment before. The chamber doors opened, and a Combine official entered to explain the rules of the trial, one final time before I was sealed inside the biome. Her voice was formal, practiced, the tone of someone who had delivered this same speech hundreds of times before. "The trial biome recreates the natural habitat of the Kryn Hollow Fang," she said. "You will be given standard time to track, isolate, and subdue the creature using approved methods. Killing the beast is strictly forbidden and will result in immediate disqualification and formal shame recorded against your name. The goal of the hunt trials is mastery, not destruction." I nodded to show I understood, and she continued, "You may call for extraction at any time using the signal device on your wrist. There is no shame in early extraction for a novice." There it was again. That word, spoken so casually, as if it explained everything about what I was and was not capable of. "I won't need it," I said. She studied me for a moment, the same way the old hunter outside had studied me, searching for something behind my calm expression. Whatever she found there, she did not comment on it. She simply nodded once and gestured toward the sealed door leading into the biome chamber. "Good fortune," she said, and left the room. Oliver lingered a moment longer before following her out, pausing at the doorway to look back at me. "The biome will feel real," he said quietly. "The sensors that manage safety are limited, but everything else, the fear, the exhaustion, the danger, all of that will be real enough." "I've been in worse places," I said. He did not ask what I meant by that. He simply nodded once and left me alone in the quiet chamber. I spent the remaining minutes reviewing everything I knew about the Kryn Holofang, piecing together fragments from what the handler had told me earlier and what little information the Combine's public archives allowed contestants to access before a trial. The creature was a solitary hunter, built for narrow stone canyons and dark underground passages. It relied heavily on heat detection rather than sight, which meant its greatest strength in darkness could also become its greatest weakness if I understood how to manage my own heat signature. It marked its territory using scent trails along canyon walls, meaning its movement patterns were not random but deliberate, following paths it had walked many times before. This was not unlike tracking large predators back on Earth during the years after the ecological collapse, when certain species had grown far more dangerous than nature ever intended, forcing trackers like myself to learn methods that blended patience with precision, understanding with quiet nerve. I had learned then that the deadliest mistake a hunter could make was treating a predator as a mindless threat to be overpowered through strength alone. The truly dangerous ones were not defeated with force, they were outthought. The chamber lights dimmed, signaling the trial was about to begin. I rose from the table, shouldered my small pack, and walked toward the sealed door as it slid open with a quiet hiss, revealing a dark passage leading down into the trial biome. Before stepping through, I allowed myself one final thought about the ceremony that had unfolded hours earlier. The laughter, the mockery, the certainty in Princess Cheveleth's voice that I would call for extraction before finding even a single trace of the beast. I did not feel anger toward her. Anger clouds judgment, and judgment was the one thing I could not afford to lose once I stepped into that darkness. Instead, I felt something closer to quiet resolve, the same feeling I remembered from years earlier, standing at the edge of a frozen forest back home, knowing that the creature waiting somewhere in the trees ahead did not care about titles either. I stepped through the door, and it sealed shut behind me with a heavy metallic sound that echoed briefly before fading into silence. The passage ahead was carved from dark stone, lit only by faint strips of pale light embedded along the upper edges of the walls. The air was cool and still, carrying a faint mineral scent that reminded me of deep caves, and somewhere far ahead, barely audible, I could hear the slow drip of water striking stone. I paused at the entrance, letting my eyes adjust fully to the dim light, and allowed my senses to settle into the same careful rhythm I had used countless times before, back when survival depended entirely on patience rather than aggression. The heat reader in my pack hummed quietly as I switched it on, its small display casting a faint blue glow against my palm. No heat signatures nearby yet. Good. That meant I had time to study the terrain before the creature became aware of my presence. I moved forward slowly, keeping close to the canyon wall, studying the faint scent markings the handler had mentioned, thin discolored streaks along the stone that seemed to follow a deliberate path deeper into the passage. If the hollow fang used these trails as territory markers, then understanding their pattern would tell me far more about the creature's habits than any amount of reckless searching ever could. The passage narrowed as I continued, the ceiling dropping lower, forcing me to move with careful, measured steps to avoid making unnecessary noise. Every few meters, I paused to check the heat reader, watching for the faint telltale glow that would signal the creature's presence somewhere in the darkness ahead. It was slow work, methodical and quiet, nothing like the dramatic confrontation the noble hunters had likely imagined when they pictured this trial unfolding. There was no charge into danger, no reckless display of strength. There was only patience, the same patience that had kept me steady through countless difficult nights long before the stars had ever opened up to humanity. After nearly 20 minutes of careful movement, the heat reader in my hand finally flickered, a faint warm signature appearing at the very edge of its detection range, deep within a side passage branching off from the main canyon. I stopped completely, crouching low against the stone wall, watching the small display as the signature shifted slowly, moving in a slow, deliberate pattern that suggested the creature was patrolling rather than actively hunting. This told me something important. It did not yet know I was here. I allowed myself a small measure of quiet satisfaction, though I kept my expression carefully neutral, aware that overconfidence at this stage could easily undo everything I had built so far. The creature's patrol pattern gave me valuable information, a rhythm I could study, predict, and eventually use to my advantage. I settled into position along the canyon wall, watching the faint heat signature drift slowly through the side passage, memorizing its pattern the way I had once studied the movement patterns of dangerous predators back home, learning their rhythms long before ever attempting to approach. Time passed slowly in the quiet dark, each minute stretching out as I studied the creature's movement, building a picture in my mind of exactly how it patrolled its territory, where it paused, where it seemed most alert, and where its attention seemed to wander. Far above me, unseen, I knew the entire Combine nobility was watching this unfold through the broadcast feeds, waiting eagerly for the moment I would inevitably panic, call for extraction, and confirm every mocking word Princess Chevelith had spoken earlier that day. They would have a long wait, because I had no intention of giving them the ending they expected. I intended to give them something else entirely. I waited until the creature's patrol pattern completed a full circuit before I moved again, keeping my body low against the canyon wall as I followed the side passage the heat signature had drifted through moments earlier. The stone here was rougher, marked with deep claw grooves that ran along both walls at roughly shoulder height, evidence of a creature that had carved its territory into the rock itself over years of patrolling the same paths. I ran my fingers lightly across one groove, feeling its depth, its age, understanding without needing to see the beast itself that this was not a young or inexperienced predator. This was something that had survived long enough to become confident in its own dominance. Confidence, I had learned long ago, was often the very thing that could be turned against a predator if you understood how to use it properly. The passage sloped downward, the air growing cooler and heavier with moisture the deeper I traveled, until the faint sound of dripping water I had heard earlier became a steady rhythm somewhere ahead, echoing softly off unseen walls. My heat reader flickered again, this time showing the signature much closer, no longer at the edge of detection but clearly visible, moving in a slow arc that suggested the creature had paused somewhere just beyond the next bend in the passage. I stopped completely, pressing my back against the cold stone, and allowed my breathing to slow into the same controlled rhythm I had trained myself to use during long nights of tracking, back when a single careless breath could mean the difference between success and disaster. This was the moment where most hunters made their first true mistake. Eager after finally locating their target, they rushed forward, driven by adrenaline rather than judgment, forgetting that finding a predator and safely approaching it were two entirely different challenges. I did not move forward yet. Instead, I studied the passage ahead, noting the way the stone walls narrowed just beyond the bend, creating a natural choke point that would limit the creature's ability to maneuver if I could somehow guide it there. I also noted the faint draft of air moving past me toward the creature's position, carrying my scent directly toward it if I advanced any further without accounting for it. This was useful information. Rather than trying to hide my presence entirely, which would be nearly impossible given the draft, I could instead use my scent deliberately, controlling exactly when and how the creature became aware of me, rather than allowing it to detect me on its own terms. I reached into my pack and retrieved a small cloth, dampened slightly with water from my canteen, and used it to wipe down my exposed skin, reducing the strength of my scent just enough to buy myself additional time without eliminating it completely. It would not hide me forever, but it would slow the moment of discovery, giving me valuable extra seconds to position myself exactly where I needed to be. I moved forward slowly, choosing each step with deliberate care, avoiding loose stones and testing the ground ahead with the lightest possible pressure before committing my full weight. The narrow choke point in the passage came into view exactly as I had pictured it, a natural bottleneck formed by two large stone outcroppings that nearly met in the middle, leaving only a narrow gap wide enough for a single body to pass through. Beyond the choke point, The passage opened into a wider chamber, and it was there, in the pale light filtering down from some unseen opening far above, that I finally saw the hollow fang for the first time. It was larger than I expected, its body low and powerful, covered in dark-plated scales that seemed to absorb the faint light around it, rather than reflect it. Its head was broad and angular, with deep sensory pits along its jaw that I recognized immediately as the source of its heat detection abilities. Its limbs were thick and muscular, built for both speed and sudden bursts of power, and its long tail swept slowly across the stone floor behind it as it moved in a slow patrol around the edges of the chamber. I remained perfectly still at the edge of the choke point, watching its movement, studying the way its head tilted slightly with each step, sensing rather than seeing its surroundings. It had not yet detected me, but I knew that would not last much longer. This was the moment every part of my training had prepared me for, the moment where careful observation had to transform into decisive action, where hesitation would cost far more than a bold and calculated choice. I thought back to a night years earlier, standing at the edge of a frozen ravine on Earth, tracking a creature that had grown too dangerous for the wilderness it called home, a creature that had already ended the lives of 2 experienced trackers before I had ever been called in to deal with it. I remembered the same feeling then, that razor-thin edge between overwhelming danger and complete control, and I remembered exactly how I had crossed that edge successfully, not through strength, but through patience, paired with absolute confidence in my own understanding of the creature's nature. I moved through the narrow choke point slowly, deliberately allowing a small amount of sound to escape as my boot brushed against loose stone. The hollow fang's head snapped up immediately, its sensory pits flaring as it detected the disturbance, and its low growl echoed through the chamber, a sound that vibrated through the stone floor beneath my feet. I did not run, I did not reach for any weapon. I simply stood still at the edge of the choke point, allowing the creature to fully register my presence, watching as its powerful body tensed, preparing for what it clearly expected to be an easy confrontation with prey too foolish to flee. It charged. The sound of its claws against stone was thunderous in the enclosed chamber, and for one long moment, every instinct in my body screamed at me to move, to run, to do anything except stand perfectly still in the path of something so clearly built to overpower anything smaller than itself. I held my ground. At the last possible moment, just as the creature closed the distance between us, I sidestepped smoothly through the narrow choke point, using the tight space to limit its ability to adjust its charge, forcing its powerful body to slow as it attempted to squeeze through the gap in pursuit. This was exactly what I had planned for. As its head and shoulders pushed through the narrow opening, momentarily restricted by the stone outcroppings on either side, I moved quickly along its flank, using the coil of rope from my pack to loop tightly around one of its powerful limbs, anchoring the other end to a deep groove in the stone wall that had clearly been carved by the creature's own claws over years of patrolling this same path. The hollow fang roared in frustration, thrashing against the sudden restriction, but the choke point itself worked against it, limiting the range of motion it needed to break free easily. I moved quickly, using the narrow space and the creature's own restricted position to secure a second loop around its other limb before it could fully process what was happening. This was not a fight of strength against strength. I had no illusions about winning a direct contest of raw power against a creature built for exactly that kind of confrontation. This was a fight of understanding against instinct, patience against aggression, and terrain against brute force. The creature continued to struggle for several long minutes, its powerful body straining against the restraints, but the tight confines of the choke point, combined with the anchored ropes, gradually forced its movements to slow, its aggressive lunges becoming shorter, more controlled, until finally its struggling settled into something closer to frustrated stillness. I stepped back slowly, giving it space, watching carefully as its posture shifted from aggressive to wary, its deep growl softening into something quieter, more uncertain. This, too, was something I had learned long ago. A cornered predator that continued to sense overwhelming threat would fight until exhaustion or injury, but a predator that sensed patience rather than aggression from its opponent would often, eventually, settle. I lowered myself slowly to the ground, keeping a careful distance, and remained still, allowing several long minutes to pass in silence, broken only by the creature's slow, heavy breathing. Gradually, its posture shifted further. Its head lowered slightly. Its sensory pits, once flared wide in alarm, settled into a calmer rhythm. I did not approach further than necessary. I did not attempt to dominate it through continued struggle or unnecessary force. I simply remained present, patient, and calm, allowing the creature to understand, in whatever way its instincts processed such things, that the threat it had expected was not the threat actually standing before it. After nearly half an hour, the hollow fang settled fully into stillness. Its powerful body relaxed against the restraints, no longer straining, no longer thrashing, simply present in a state of calm submission that I suspected very few, if any, of the Combine's noble hunters had ever managed to achieve with a creature of this reputation. I rose slowly, approached with careful, measured steps, and gently released the ropes from its limbs, watching closely as it remained still, showing no immediate instinct to renew its aggression now that it was free. It was, I realized in that quiet moment, not so different from many of the creatures I had faced back on Earth, animals pushed by circumstance into territories and behaviors that made them appear far more monstrous than their true nature actually was. Strip away the fear, the aggression born purely from instinct and territorial defense, and what remained was often simply a creature trying to survive in a world that had made survival difficult. I stepped back fully, giving the hollow fang complete space to move as it wished, and it did, slowly rising and retreating toward the far side of the chamber, watching me with what I could only describe as wary curiosity rather than continued hostility. The trial's completion signal chimed softly from the small device on my wrist, indicating that the required conditions for successful subduing had been met and recorded by the biome's monitoring systems. I stood quietly for a long moment, watching the creature settle into the far corner of the chamber, before finally turning to make my way back through the choke point and the winding passage that would lead me back toward the chamber's exit. I did not feel triumphant in the way I imagined the crowd above might expect. I felt only the same quiet satisfaction I had always felt after a difficult task completed through patience rather than force, a feeling far removed from the loud, celebratory displays I had witnessed from other contestants during the opening ceremony. As I walked back through the narrow passage, I found myself wondering, with mild curiosity, exactly what expression Princess Chevelith wore right now, watching the broadcast feed that had surely captured every moment of what had just unfolded in that stone chamber far beneath the surface of her homeworld. I did not have to wonder for very long. The exit door of the biome chamber slid open with the same heavy metallic sound it had made when it sealed behind me hours earlier, and I stepped back out into the bright corridor, blinking against the sudden change in light after so long spent in the dim passages below. The corridor, which had been filled with quiet murmurs and idle chatter when I first entered the preparation chamber, was now completely silent. A crowd had gathered near the entrance, far larger than the small group that had seen me off earlier, and every single face turned toward me the moment I stepped through the doorway. I recognized some of them as noble contestants who had already completed their own trials. Others were officials, handlers, and staff members who had clearly abandoned their usual duties to witness this particular moment in person rather than through the broadcast feed. No one spoke. Oliver stood near the front of the group, and his expression was unlike anything I had seen from him earlier that day. The curious, cautious respect he had shown me in the preparation chamber had transformed into something closer to quiet astonishment. "You subdued it in under 2 hours," he said finally, his voice carrying easily through the silent corridor. "No injury recorded, not even a minor one." I said nothing, simply nodding once in acknowledgement as I continued walking down the corridor, the crowd parting slowly to let me through, though several of them continued watching me with expressions I found difficult to fully read. As I made my way toward the central hall where contestants gathered between trials, I began to notice something subtle but unmistakable in the way people around me behaved. The noble hunters who had ignored me completely during the opening ceremony now stepped aside as I approached, several of them lowering their eyes rather than meeting my gaze directly. One older hunter, a broad-shouldered man with deep scars across one side of his face, the same man who had briefly spoken to me before I entered the preparation chamber, stood near the entrance to the central hall. He watched me approach with an expression of careful consideration, the kind of look I imagined experienced trackers back on Earth might give one another after witnessing something unexpected in the field. As I passed him, he spoke quietly, in a tone meant only for me. "You did not fight it," he said. It was not quite a question. "No," I said. "I understood it." He studied me for a long moment, then nodded slowly, stepping back to allow me to pass without further comment. It was such a small gesture, easy to overlook, but I recognized it immediately for what it was. Respect, offered quietly, without the need for grand declarations. Inside the central hall, the atmosphere shifted even further. Groups of nobles who had been engaged in loud conversation before my trial now spoke in hushed tones, occasionally glancing in my direction, before quickly looking away when I noticed. A few of the younger contestants, clearly still processing what they had seen on the broadcast feed, watched me with something close to open curiosity rather than the mockery I had grown used to since arriving on this world. I found a quiet corner of the hall and sat down, allowing myself a moment to simply breathe after the tension of the trial, when Oliver approached again, this time accompanied by an older woman I recognized as one of the senior Combine officials who had overseen the opening ceremony. "The council would like a formal review of your methods," the woman said, her tone far more measured and respectful than it had been during the earlier ceremony. "What you demonstrated does not match any recorded hunting technique in our archives." "It's not complicated," I said. "I studied the creature's patterns before approaching it. I used the terrain to limit its options rather than trying to overpower its strength directly. I gave it space once it understood I was not the threat its instincts expected. Our hunters are trained from childhood to demonstrate strength and dominance during a hunt," she said slowly. "The idea of understanding a creature's nature well enough to calm it, rather than overpower it entirely, is not something our traditions have ever emphasized." "Then perhaps it's worth considering," I said simply, without any hint of arrogance in my tone. She studied me for a long moment before nodding slowly, clearly turning the thought over carefully in her mind before excusing herself to continue her duties elsewhere in the hall. As the day continued, word of what had happened in the trial biome spread rapidly through every corner of the compound, carried not just through official channels, but through the kind of quiet, urgent whispers that travel faster than any formal announcement ever could. By evening, several of the Combine's most celebrated hunters, contestants who had completed dozens of successful trials over the years and who normally paid no attention whatsoever to newcomers, had gathered near the edge of the central hall, quietly watching a replay of my trial on one of the large broadcast screens mounted along the far wall. I noticed them watching, though I made no move to approach or acknowledge their presence directly, choosing instead to remain seated quietly in my corner, reviewing my own memory of the trial and considering what I might have done differently. One of the hunters, a tall woman with intricate markings across both arms, indicating numerous successful trials throughout her career, finally approached me directly, her expression thoughtful rather than hostile. "I have faced 11 different apex creatures during my career," she said without preamble. "I have never once considered the approach you used today. It's not the only way to hunt," I said, "but it works when the situation calls for patience rather than force." She studied me carefully, the same way the older scarred hunter had studied me earlier. "Where I come from," she said slowly, "hunters are measured entirely by their strength, their aggression, their willingness to meet danger directly and overcome it through sheer capability. What you showed today does not fit easily into that measurement. Maybe strength isn't the only thing worth measuring, I said. She considered that for a long moment, then nodded once, a small gesture that somehow carried more weight than any elaborate speech could have. Without another word, she turned and rejoined the group of hunters near the broadcast screen, and I noticed the quiet, careful way they continued discussing what they had witnessed, their earlier confidence visibly shaken by something they had not expected to see from someone they had all dismissed so easily just hours before. It was not long after this that I noticed the change extending even further, into behaviors that surprised me more than the quiet respect of individual hunters. Later that evening, as contestants gathered for the traditional evening meal shared among all participants in the hunt trials, I noticed something unusual as I approached the long communal table. Several of the noble hunters who would normally challenge new contestants to informal duels of skill, a common practice meant to establish hierarchy among participants before the trials concluded, made no move to approach me at all. One younger noble, clearly eager to prove himself against every contestant present, moved through the hall, issuing casual challenges to nearly everyone he encountered. When he approached my table, however, he paused, glanced briefly toward the older scarred hunter sitting nearby, and then continued past without a single word. I did not fully understand the significance of this at the time, though Oliver, who had taken to lingering nearby throughout the evening with obvious curiosity about my continued presence, later explained it to me quietly. Challenging a hunter after witnessing what you did today would be seen as reckless, he said. No one wants to be the next person humiliated on a broadcast feed watched by the entire combine. I considered this quietly, recognizing the strange shift taking place around me, a shift built not from fear exactly, but from a kind of careful uncertainty that had not existed in this compound before my trial began. Only one person, it seemed, remained entirely unaffected by this quiet shift in atmosphere. Princess Chevelith arrived at the communal meal later than most other contestants, and the moment she entered the hall, the earlier hush that had settled over the room seemed to break slightly, as though everyone present was suddenly aware that the true test of the day's events had not yet fully concluded. She walked directly toward my table, her expression carefully composed, though I noticed a subtle tightness around her eyes that suggested the calm confidence she projected was not quite as effortless as it had been during the earlier ceremony. "I watched the broadcast," she said, stopping a short distance from where I sat. Impressive, for a beginner's luck. Several nearby hunters exchanged uneasy glances at her words, clearly surprised she had chosen to continue her earlier mockery, despite everything that had unfolded that day. "Luck doesn't explain reading a creature's territorial patterns before approaching it," I said calmly. "But you're welcome to believe whatever helps you sleep tonight." A few quiet murmurs moved through the surrounding tables, and I saw the older scarred hunter, seated not far away, lower his gaze slightly as though trying to avoid drawing further attention to himself. Princess Chevelith's expression tightened further, her earlier composure slipping just slightly at the edges. "You mistake a single fortunate outcome for actual skill," she said, her voice carrying a slight edge that had not been present during her earlier mockery. "The hollow fang is dangerous, yes, but it is not the true measure of a hunter's worth in our traditions." "Then perhaps," I said quietly, "you should choose a measure you trust completely and face me directly." The hall fell completely silent. I had not planned to issue such a direct challenge, but something in her continued refusal to acknowledge what had happened, her insistence on clinging to the same dismissive certainty she had shown from the very beginning, made the words leave my mouth before I had fully considered them. Princess Chevelith stared at me for a long moment, and I watched something shift behind her eyes, a flicker of surprise quickly replaced by renewed determination. "Very well," she said finally, her voice carrying clearly through the silent hall. "The final trial ceremony tomorrow will decide this properly, in front of everyone who doubts what I know to be true." She turned and walked away without another word, leaving behind a hall full of hunters, officials, and contestants who understood, perhaps better than either of us fully realized in that moment, that tomorrow would settle something far larger than a simple disagreement between two proud individuals. I remained seated quietly, aware of the weight of dozens of eyes still lingering on me, and allowed myself only a brief moment to consider what tomorrow might bring before turning my attention back to the meal in front of me, my mind already beginning, quietly and carefully, to prepare for what would come next. The following morning arrived with a heavier silence than I had felt since first stepping onto the Combine homeworld, the kind of silence that settles over a place right before something important is about to happen. Word of the challenge had spread through the entire compound overnight, and by the time I made my way toward the central courtyard where the final ceremony was scheduled to take place, a crowd far larger than the one that had witnessed my first trial had already gathered, filling every available space along the stone terraces surrounding the open ground. Oliver found me near the edge of the courtyard, his expression carrying a mixture of excitement and concern that I suspected many of the younger staff members shared that morning. "The council has approved a modified trial," he said quietly. "Not a hunt against a beast this time. A direct tracking challenge between you and the princess, judged by the senior hunters." "What does that mean exactly?" I asked. "Both of you will be given the same terrain, the same rules, and the same objective," he explained. "Locate and secure a marked target, hidden somewhere within the trial grounds before the other. Whoever succeeds first, using approved methods, wins." I nodded slowly, understanding immediately that this was not a contest of strength, but of skill, patience, and understanding, precisely the areas where I suspected Princess Chevelith least expected to be tested. Across the courtyard, I could see her preparing with her usual circle of noble supporters, her expression composed and confident, though I noticed the same subtle tightness around her eyes that I had seen the previous evening. The senior official who had spoken with me after my first trial approached the center of the courtyard, raising her voice to address the gathered crowd. "This challenge will be judged fairly, according to established trial standards," she announced. "Both contestants will begin from opposite ends of the outer canyon grounds. The target, a marked stone sphere, has been placed somewhere within the designated area. Whoever secures it first, through skill rather than force, will be declared the winner of this challenge." The crowd murmured with anticipation as both Princess Chevelith and I were led to opposite ends of the wide canyon grounds stretching beyond the courtyard, a terrain far more open than the enclosed stone chambers of my earlier trial, filled with scattered rock formations, shallow ravines, and patches of dense vegetation clinging to the canyon walls. As we took our positions, Princess Chevelith glanced across the distance separating us, her expression unreadable from so far away, though I could imagine easily enough the determination she carried into this moment. A single horn sounded across the canyon, signaling the beginning of the trial, and both of us moved forward into the terrain at the same instant. I did not rush. Rushing had never been my strength, and I saw no reason to abandon the careful methods that had served me so well just a day earlier. Instead, I moved steadily along the canyon floor, studying the terrain with the same careful attention I had used while tracking the hollow fang, searching for any sign that might indicate where the marked sphere had been hidden. The ground here told its own story, if one knew how to read it properly. Disturbed patches of loose stone suggested recent foot traffic from the officials who had placed the target. Slight variations in vegetation growth hinted at areas that had been recently disturbed and then carefully restored to appear undisturbed. I followed these small clues patiently, piecing together a picture of the canyon's recent history the same way I had once pieced together the movements of dangerous predators across unfamiliar terrain back on Earth. Somewhere across the canyon, I occasionally caught brief glimpses of Princess Chevelith moving with impressive speed and confidence, covering ground far more quickly than I did, relying clearly on raw skill and physical capability honed through years of formal training. I did not attempt to match her pace. Instead, I continued my slower, methodical search, trusting the same patient discipline that had already proven itself once during this trial. After nearly an hour of careful searching, I noticed a particular section of canyon wall where the natural growth of pale moss seemed subtly disrupted, a small detail easy to overlook unless one had spent years training their eyes to notice exactly these kinds of minor inconsistencies in natural terrain. I approached carefully, studying the area more closely, and found a narrow crevice partially concealed behind a cluster of dense vegetation, clearly deliberate in its placement, rather than a natural formation. Reaching carefully into the crevice, my fingers brushed against something smooth and cool, distinctly different from the surrounding rock. I withdrew a small, marked stone sphere, exactly matching the description given during the official announcement. I straightened, holding the sphere carefully, and looked across the canyon toward where I could still see Princess Sha-Velith moving swiftly through a different section of terrain, still searching with visible determination. I could have simply raised the sphere immediately, ending the trial then and there, claiming victory in front of the gathered crowd, but something held me back from doing so. Instead, I called out across the canyon, my voice carrying clearly through the open air. "Princess," I said, loud enough for her to hear, "the target has been found." She turned toward me, her expression shifting rapidly from surprise to something closer to disbelief as she registered the marked sphere held clearly in my hand. For a long moment, she simply stood still, and I could see, even from this distance, the internal struggle playing out across her features. She could have argued, could have claimed the trial invalid, could have found any number of ways to dismiss what had just happened, the same way she had dismissed everything else about me since my arrival. Instead, after a long moment of visible hesitation, she began walking slowly across the canyon toward where I stood, her posture noticeably different from the confident stride she had carried just an hour earlier. The senior officials moved forward as well, confirming the marked sphere's authenticity, and a quiet murmur of surprise moved through the gathered crowd watching from the terraces above. When Princess Sha-Velith finally reached me, she studied the sphere in my hand for a long moment before finally raising her eyes to meet mine directly. "You found it before I even reached the far section of the canyon," she said quietly, her voice carrying none of the sharp confidence it had held during our previous encounters. "How?" "I wasn't looking for the fastest path," I said. "I was looking for the story the ground was already telling me." She considered this for a long moment, something shifting behind her expression that I had not seen from her before, a kind of quiet reassessment that seemed to reach far deeper than simply accepting defeat in a single trial. "My people are taught that strength and speed define a true hunter," she said slowly. "We are taught to overcome challenges directly, through capability and force. We are not taught to simply understand something so thoroughly that force becomes unnecessary." "Maybe that's worth teaching now," I said, without any trace of mockery in my tone. She studied me for a long moment, and for the first time since our very first encounter, I saw something in her expression that was not pride, nor mockery, nor even simple frustration, but genuine, careful curiosity. "Your people," she said slowly, "survived hardships severe enough to shape this kind of patience into instinct." "We did," I said simply. "It wasn't easy. It still isn't, most days." She nodded slowly, turning to address the gathered crowd, her voice carrying clearly across the canyon, steady, despite whatever internal reassessment she was clearly still working through. "The trial results stand," she announced. "The tracking challenge is decided fairly, and I withdraw every word of mockery I spoke since this contestant's arrival." The crowd murmured with surprise at her admission, and I noticed the senior officials exchanging quiet glances, clearly recognizing the significance of what had just been publicly acknowledged. In the days that followed, the Combine's Ranking Council convened a formal review of the classification system used for new contestants, ultimately deciding that humanity's unique approach to challenge and survival could not be adequately measured by any existing tier within their traditional hunter hierarchy. Rather than assigning a new, higher rank, the Council instead created something entirely unprecedented, a designation reserved specifically for contestants whose methods and capabilities fell outside every previous category the Combine had ever recognized. The senior hunters I had encountered throughout the trials, once dismissive or entirely indifferent to my presence, adopted a quiet, careful respect that followed me through every remaining day of my time on their homeworld. A respect built not from fear, but from genuine uncertainty about exactly what they were truly dealing with. Princess Chevelith and I spoke several more times before my eventual departure, and though our conversations never lost a certain formal distance, I recognized in her a willingness to reconsider assumptions that had, until my arrival, gone completely unchallenged throughout her entire life. As I finally boarded the transport that would carry me back toward Earth, Oliver approached one last time, his expression carrying the same quiet curiosity that had first drawn him to speak with me before my very first trial. "They still don't know what to call you," he said. "Not Novice, not quite Apex either, something else entirely." I considered this for a moment, watching the Combine homeworld's twin suns catch the edges of distant canyon walls beyond the transport bay. "That's all right," I said. "Some things don't need a name to be understood." The transport doors closed, and as the ship lifted away from the surface, carrying me back toward home, I found myself thinking not of the mockery that had greeted my arrival, nor even of the quiet respect that had followed, but simply of the creature I had left behind in that dark stone chamber, calm now, understood rather than conquered, a reminder that the deepest kind of strength rarely announces itself loudly. It simply waits, patiently, for the moment it is truly needed.